The theme of my keynote today, I wanted to talk about it's an old writing phrase that I think a lot of us have been taught through school or through our writing classes, which is the phrase, write what you know. And I wanted to dissect that a little bit and kind of turn it on its head a little bit. Now I'm going to be drawing in a couple of different things that are sort of happening in the publishing industry right now, at least in the young adult movement. This call for more diversity in fiction, the sort of own voices movement. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of that, but essentially own voices essentially just stands for people who are writing about or characters or themes of marginalization who share that marginalization. So I am a Korean woman, and if I were to write a main character with a Korean main character, a main character who is also Korean, that would be considered an own voices novel. And that's kind of the only definition. It doesn't have to be more specific than that. It doesn't have to get so specific as this, my main character shares absolutely every marginalization with me, because then why would I do that? That would just be a memoir. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of write what you know, because the first book I wrote, my first two books, don't feature a protagonist that on the outset looks like me. I wanted to expand that a little bit into this idea of write what you know to be true. And I think there's a little bit of a difference there. Because I tend to find this idea of just writing what you know to be incredibly limiting. Because if you were to only write about your own very specific, narrow experiences, again, we would all be writing memoirs. And this is not at all to knock memoirists out there. I love memoirs. One of my favorites is Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. I do, and I'm not knocking that at all. But when we talk about writing what we know, and I want to say write what you know to be true, writing what you know to be true about yourself and your human experiences. And so this idea of write what you know, and people just assume that this is what I know. It wasn't what I knew. I grew up in California. My mother is an immigrant, yes. My father is white. I went to small private schools. We were part of country clubs. We didn't have that sort of immigrant narrative. And my own mother is pretty westernized, even though she grew up in Korea. Her favorite food is a hamburger. So, a lot of those sorts of things, and she's, all of her cultural touchstones even are like Pollyanna, the Haley Mills movie, or Anne of Green Gables. That was one of the first books my mother ever gave me to read. So, it's a lot of these cultural touchstones and this conflict between the old world and the new world didn't exist, and I didn't really know how to edit these books. And so when I was writing, or at least when I was writing for publication, I thought that this was what people needed from me at first, was this preconceived idea, this narrow idea of what they thought someone like me should write, the sort of story that they want from me. But the first couple of books I wrote like this were really boring because there was no heart here. This wasn't my experience, despite the fact that it was technically own voices. It was a Korean narrator with immigrant parents, but I had no connection to it. And so I had to re-examine this idea of write what you know, because this was not what I knew at all. So I thought about this and I said, write what you know to be true. So what did I know to be true? I knew I liked all things goth. I liked Hades and Persephone myths. I really loved David Bowie. I love the movie Labyrinth for multiple reasons. Obviously because I grew up with Jim Henson and the Muppets, but also the protagonist of the movie is Sarah, and that's my first name, even though that's not what I go by. So I knew all these sorts of things. I liked fairies and elves and goblins. And I really, really, really loved Mozart. That's kind of a weird thing to admit to somebody, but I had this like very strange crush on Mozart when I was young. So I knew a lot about him. And I wanted to write something that combined all of my loves. So that was the genesis of where Winter Song came from. We want to put books out into the world that readers can connect to, that they can find pieces of themselves in. That was initially that was what I thought I wanted to do myself, because growing up there weren't a lot of kids like me in books, and not even talking about Asian people, but people with bipolar disorder, queer children. We didn't see a lot of ourselves in books, and so I thought initially, all right, I'm going to write a book for them. And I think that was the wrong impulse, because it wasn't what I knew to be true. I could only ever write for the reader I had been. So a lot of the books that I write and that I work on are books that I would have wanted to read at that age. What I wanted to read when I was reading Harry Potter, and I loved Harry Potter. I think Harry Potter spanned about 15 years of my life, because I read the first book when I was 11, and the last book came out when I was 22, and then the movies continued to come out after that. And I loved Harry Potter, but what I wanted most was Harry Potter, but from Cho Chang's point of view. I wanted her to be the main character. And so I am writing for myself, and that's what I know to be true. I'm writing for myself, and in doing so, I find other readers who are like me. And this idea, too, of wanting to lift up marginalized voices, if you're a person who comes from a place of privilege, like myself, I grew up pretty wealthy. So I didn't grow up working class. I didn't know a lot of poor people. So when I talk about class or poverty in fiction, it's not honest in some ways. And so I can't go about saying, I'm going to write a book for poor people, or for people growing up in poverty because they've never had those books. That's not an honest impulse. So when you write what you know to be true, it's ultimately it's selfish, but it's also self-love, and I think that's really important when it comes to writing fiction.